Well, let's take our Bibles, please, and turn back to the Old Testament book again of Daniel and the 11th chapter. Daniel chapter 11. We're going to actually be talking today about the massacre at Jerusalem, and probably won't finish, and we'll continue with that next time. I was in Jerusalem just back in January, and I stood beside the ancient wall and touched stones that were 2,500 years old. And I thought to myself of all the times that city had been basically bathed in blood. And I thought to myself of even what took place around 175 BC, something involving someone by the name of Antiochus Epiphanes who lived long ago. And you say, well, why are we studying him? Because he's a picture of somebody yet to come, somebody we know to be the Antichrist. And both of these men were and will be control freaks. And they will want power. That's always been the devil's greatest desire, by the way, power. Currently in our nation, the United States, it's all about who's in control. Who's in control? And I don't know about you, but I've noticed our liberty slipping away at an escalated rate. In some states, it's now assumed that your kids are the property of the state, which is absolutely crazy. My wife and I dedicated each and every one of our children to God, and I don't know where the state comes in. But anyway, they want to tell you how to educate your kids, how to raise your kids, and what your kids ought to believe. And they talk about this village. You've heard of the village? I've seen the village. I don't want them raising my kids. I don't want them raising my grandkids, as it were. But that's always been the devil's desire. It's been about control, and we are losing our liberties 1 inch at a time. And may I say to you without stutter or stammer, once they're given up, they're gone forever. We don't get them back. But it's always been about control. It always will be. There's a one world ruler coming on the scene, the Antichrist. He's going to put an identification or chip on everybody. He's going to know where they are and what they're buying, because the Antichrist will control. He desires control. Antiochus Epiphanes wanted control. And Antiochus, as we read about him here in Daniel chapter 11, basically suckered in others with these treaties, with these lies, and then he sees control. And the Antichrist is even going to take control of the Holy Land, and he's going to start giving away some of it in order to gain favor and support and popularity. And it's going to work. He's going to get the backing of the simple, and he's going to divide up the Holy Land. And may I say to you, that's always been the rub of the ages. The matter of the ages is who controls that parcel of property there. Well, it was originally given to the Jews by God. But you've always had the ungodly down through the centuries trying to take it away or part of it up and divide it. And nobody has any right to do that but God himself. And there are many examples, even modern day ones, secular ones, of those who've tried to give away that land, and a lot of disaster coming their way. When diplomats give a chunk of the land up, there's always something that happens. God himself deeded that land to Abraham. The descendants of Abraham have always had it, going back to the Pentateuch. And so when we start talking about dividing up the West Bank and the Gaza Strip and Jerusalem and whatever, according to God, that is the Jews. And that's a last day thing, folks. Joel, a last day book, chapter 3 and verse 2, God says, I will also gather all nations and bring them down into the valley of Jehoshaphat, and I will plead with them there for my people and for my heritage, Israel, whom they have scattered among the nations, notice this, and parted my land. Parted my land. You're going to see that going on, and it is, in the last days. The dividing of the land is a last day sign, and that is something that God is very, very sensitive about, the Jew and their land. Now, if God expels them from the land, that's divine judgment. And he did with Babylon, he did with Rome, but the Jew has to be in the land in the last days. Did you know that? That's part of last day prophecy, because God always deals with Israel based upon their land, the land that he has given to them for an everlasting possession. Well, Antiochus Epiphanes, he's going to play Robin Hood. We've talked about that. He's going to take from the rich, he's going to give to the poor, and he's going to give the land away. And at first, it's going to kind of catapult him into rock star status, but it won't last. You've heard the old expression, the honeymoon's over. That's coming. He's going to get it where the chicken gets the axe, and I'm looking forward to that part. But for now, in Daniel chapter 11, we read in verse 24, he shall enter peaceably even unto the fattest places of the province, and he shall do that which his fathers have not done, nor his fathers' fathers. He shall scatter among them the prey and spoil and riches. We talked about as socialism. Yea, and he shall forecast his devices against the strongholds, even for a time. Those are important words. Even for a time. In other words, it's not going to last. It's going to backfire. Now, what happens here in chapter 25 backs up to verse 21. And we've got Daniel basically listening to the angel Gabriel, telling the future of his people. And these 4 verses from verse 21 to verse 25 talk about the rise to power of Antiochus Epiphanes. But verses 25, 26, and 27 are going to revert back to an old pattern that we've seen plenty of up to this point, with Egypt in the south and Syria in the north going back and forth and fighting and popping each other in the eye, giving each other a black eye, and then the other guy goes down, he smacks the other guy, and we find out that like a ping pong ball, this is going to go back and forth. And here is Israel in the middle, same old, same old. Now, backing up, I mentioned last time, Antiochus Epiphanes had a nephew, and that nephew was part of an arranged marriage. This nephew becomes the king of Egypt. And who is this nephew? Well, remember Cleopatra? We talked about Cleopatra. Well, Antiochus Epiphanes was her brother. So Cleopatra is the sister of Antiochus. And remember that arranged marriage? You have a Syrian marrying an Egyptian. By the way, both those countries are still around today, and they're known by those names 2,200 years later. So anyway, they were supposed to make peace between them, but it didn't last. Cleopatra's husband died in 180 BC, and Cleopatra took over. 7 years later, in 173 BC, Cleopatra died. And Antiochus became the king up north of Assyria in 175 AD, or BC. So anyway, you've got about a 7-year overlap here. Antiochus is the king of Syria. Cleopatra's husband was the king of Egypt. And now he dies. Cleopatra becomes queen. Brother and sister, if you think about it, are running these two world powers. And there's an overlap for about 5 years or so. But when Cleopatra dies in 173 BC, now the son of Cleopatra and her husband take the throne in Egypt. And Ptolemy Philometor V, he's the son of Cleopatra, makes him the nephew of Antiochus Epiphanes. Basically, this Ptolemy V is only a teenager when his mother dies. So just to give you some idea, you've got Syria up here with famous towns like Damascus and Tyre and Sidon up here. And then down here you've got Egypt, Memphis and Alexandria and this whole area here. And so notice in the middle you've got Israel right here, this little strip of land about that big, if you will. And every time Syria goes down to pop Egypt in the eye, they pass through Israel. Every time Egypt goes up to pop Syria in the eye, they pass through Israel. And it goes on. So here's Ptolemy V now on the throne. He's only a teenager when his mom Cleopatra dies, and he's very vulnerable. And so what's Antiochus Epiphanes going to do about this situation? Well, you can about imagine. In verse number 25, it says, and he, that's Antiochus, shall stir up his power and his courage against the king of the south with a great army, and the king of the south shall be stirred up to battle with a very great and mighty army, but he shall not stand, for they shall forecast devices against him. Now, Ptolemy V, the son of Cleopatra, has this cabinet that's left over from his dad and mom. These are veteran politicians. And history tells us they didn't like this kid, this young upstart, being their boss. And so they got together. They decided to double-cross him. And they chided him by reminding him that some land they had lost to the Syrians needed to be recaptured. And notice in verse 25, it talks about the king of the south shall be stirred up to battle. It was his counselors his ambassadors who stirred him up to do this. Well, Antiochus Epiphanes gets wind of this. He assembles his army. He's going to beat the king of the south to the punch and strike first. So in the process, here he comes down and he crosses through Israel to come into Egypt to do battle. And he went over the Egyptian border this time. This is something that normally didn't happen. They would meet in the middle and they would fight in that region of Israel, and the Jews would get the worst of it. But in verse number 25, and this is all accurate according to the Bible and history, he shall stir up his power and his courage against the king of the south with a great army, and the king of the south shall be stirred up to battle with a very great mighty army, but he, the king of the south, shall not stand. He goes down. He gets whooped. He gets beat. And Ptolemy's advisors did him in by giving him bad advice. And when that happened, when the Egyptians got beat by the Syrians, history tells us that Antiochus Epiphanes went down to the Nile here, and there he crowned himself king of Egypt. And that's just exactly like the Antichrist. He's going to have that same ego. Remember that Antiochus Epiphanes spent some time in Greece. Guess who his hero was? His hero was Alexander the Great. Now, he was nowhere close to Alexander the Great. He was kind of a legend in his mind, but probably every morning he got up and saluted this bust of Alexander the Great. And this egomaniac now crowns himself king of Egypt. And by the way, the Antichrist is going to be an egomaniac too. And the devil is an egomaniac. The devil was the one who said, I will ascend up on high. He said, I'll be like the Most High. And though the devil's an industrial strength loser, he's got a big ego. So Antiochus crowns himself king of Egypt, and then he goes back home. And when he left, the Egyptians crowned the younger brother of Ptolemy V to be the new king of Egypt. Here's his name, Eugetes Philopator. Eugetes Philopator. And here we have Ptolemy V now done in by his advisors. And the last part of verse 25 mentions that though he had a great army, he shall not stand, notice this part, for they shall forecast devices against him. In other words, they gave him bad advice, bad counsel. They did it on purpose, though they were in his own cabin. It was the demise of Ptolemy V, bad counsel. May I stop here and say, be careful about where you get your counsel. Be careful about who you listen to. Did you know there's more bad counsel out there than there is good counsel? You ever stop to think about that? Most counsel is not biblical counsel. It's counsel of the world. And so if Ptolemy V was going to go to war, he should have counseled with his colonels, his majors, his generals, but he did not. He got bad counsel. Bible says in Proverbs 20, every purpose is established by counsel, and with good advice make war. He did not do that, and it did him in. You know that Christ even talked about this matter of going to war with good counsel in Luke 14. He said, or what king going to make war against another king sitteth not down first and consulteth whether he be able with 10,000 to meet him that cometh against him with 20,000. You realize Christ talked about very practical things like this? Well, Antiochus Epiphanes, and at this point Ptolemy VI, decided after the battle to sit down and have some peace talks. And you read in verse number 27 here, it says, and both these kings' hearts shall be to do mischief, and they shall speak lies at one table, but it shall not prosper, for yet the end shall be at the time appointed. Notice they both sit down at the table and they lie through their teeth. You would expect that from a slimy snake like Antiochus Epiphanes, right? A lot of smooth double talk. And historians tell us it went on both sides, and in record time the treaties were broken. Neither man had any intention of keeping them. And this is a picture of the Antichrist, by the way. The Antichrist, no shock, who's the devil incarnate, is going to be a liar because the devil's a liar. Christ had this to say about old Lucifer. He said to the religious crowd, you of your father the devil, and the lust of your father ye will do, that is, crucify him. He was a murderer from the beginning, and abode not in the truth, because there is no truth in him. When he speaketh of his own, for he is a liar and the father of it. The devil is a industrial strength liar. You say, well, how do you know if the devil's lying? Just check to see if his mouth is moving. Basically, if his mouth is moving, he's lying. Now, here's Christ, and he was always truthful. The devil is the opposite, and the Antichrist is going to be the opposite, the polar opposite. The devil is an industrial strength liar, and so is the Antichrist. They're basically going to be the same person. And we read in the book of the Revelation about the Antichrist. In chapter 13, it says, and there was given unto him a mouth speaking great things and blasphemies, and power was given unto him to continue 40 and 2 months. That's going to be his heyday. 3.5 years, last half of the tribulation period. Now, back here in Daniel chapter 11 again, it says, and both these kings' hearts shall be to do mischief, and they shall speak lies at one table, but it shall not prosper, for yet the end shall be at the time appointed. This is interesting. In other words, God has a timetable. God has an appointed time. God is never early in what he does. God is never late in what he does. God is always on time. God always has a master plan. And even as wannabes like Antiochus and the Antichrist are doing their thing, they're only fulfilling what's within the framework of God. God has an appointed time. Now, in verse number 28, it goes on. It says, then shall he return unto his land with great riches, and his heart shall be against the holy covenant, and he shall do exploits and return to his own land. Here's where we get to the massacre at Jerusalem. Now, how did this all start? Well, we find out back in Daniel 10 that the aged prophet Daniel, maybe in his early 90s, he's praying, he's fasting for 3 weeks, and he's begging God to show him the future of his people Israel. All right, that's how it all started. It was the 3rd year of Cyrus. It was about 530 BC. And now Daniel is hearing of stuff that's going to happen after he's dead and gone and he's in his grave. In fact, what we're looking at here in Daniel chapter 11 was right around 175 BC. So you've got about a 350-year difference from the time Daniel's praying, wanting to know what's coming, and now we see it happening, the future of the Jews. So back to Antiochus. He's the king of Syria, and Israel is under the control of Syria. Remember, we saw that. And so he's going to go to work at this point, now that all that's been done. He's going to go to work persecuting the Jews, and he's going to put it into overdrive, basically, because he's the picture of the Antichrist. Now, we're going to be gone when the Antichrist is on the scene, I believe, in a pre-trib rapture. And if we want to know what's going to be going on at that time, if we want to know what the Antichrist is going to be like, all we have to do is look at Antiochus Epiphanes, because both of them are going to hate the Jews, try the Jews, and most of all, try and stamp out the identity of the Jewish people. They're going to try and change the Jews. Now, that's impossible. You can't stamp out the Jews. That is futile. That is fruitless. It just won't happen. You will never get rid of the Jew. God promised to them perpetuity. From the time he crowned Abraham as that brightest star in the Hebrew heaven, that founder of Judaism, God has promised the Jew perpetuity. And let me just say this about Israel. You need nothing else to prove there's a God. The Jew proves there's a God. Because the Jew has sustained all that persecution through all those centuries and millenniums. You know, there's no Hittites around today, are there? And there's no Amorites around today, are there? There's no Amalekites. I haven't met one recently. When's the last time you met a Philistine? Anybody here meet a Philistine recently? They're all gone. They've been swept off the face of the earth. But the Jew is going to last until the end of the world. But their most trying hour is going to be the 7-year tribulation period. And it's going to be called a time of Jacob's trouble, especially the last 3.5 years. As much as the devil hates Israel because they testify of God, it is impossible for him to stamp out the Jew. But Antiochus is going to try. Yeah, he's really going to try. Now, what made it easier is he had some inroads, and we've talked about some compromisers by the name of Jason, another compromiser by the name of Menelaus, who were helping him along. And that kind of got him with his foot in the door. May I stop and say something about compromisers? There's nothing more confusing than compromise. There's nothing more dangerous than compromise. You know, there are many today, and let's just call them the new evangelical crowd, that have compromised, and they have clouded and skewed the truth because compromise confuses. It confuses the unsaved. They look at that, well, that's Bible Christianity. I can live that. You know, they've lowered the bar so low that anyone can get over it. Any lost person can live that kind of Christianity. And there's nothing that hurts the cause of Christ like compromise. And we see it in the day and age in which we live. It's been prophesied to take place in the last days. These are the days of apostasy. And as a result, we find that Christ gave this admonition to strive to enter in at the strait gate. For many, I say unto you, will seek to enter in and shall not be able. You know, he's not talking about atheists here. He's not talking about infidels. He's not talking about modernists and even traditionalists, you know, the mainline, streamlined denomination like I grew up in. He's not talking about that. He's talking about those who are striving to enter in, thinking, I got that Bible Christianity thing, and they don't. They don't. That's new evangelicalism, folks. Please don't start down that road. That's our nature. It really is. That'd be my nature. And what happens is we get desensitized. Don't forget that. And without even knowing it, we lose the next generation. Please heed that warning. I am not concerned about the atheists. I am not concerned about the humanists. We have their number. It's easy to spot them. But what will do in your faith is new evangelicalism. It really will. That hip, cool, trendy, in vogue kind of Christianity. It's reinvented Bible Christianity. It's not really Bible Christianity. And so Antiochus had the help of compromisers like Jason and Menelaus, and they did away with that old fuddy-duddy Onias the high priest, and they got the Jews to compromise. And at first, it was going great. I mean, Antiochus said, hey, this is wonderful. But you know, as time went on, like sin, he wanted more. He wanted more inroads. He didn't like the arrangement. And he despised, absolutely despised all Jews, even those who were helping him. And this is something, again, the devil inspires. A real hatred toward the Jews. We call it anti-Semitism. Every age has had this. Every age, even today. And the question is, why always the Jews? Why always the Jews? I'm thinking of a Jewish fella who got born again, and he told me personally, he said, when I was growing up, my parents said, don't tell anyone what you are, because you'll be hated. You know, there's always been a devilish contempt for Israel, even yet today. And that's why, as a church, we've taken our stand on the side of Israel. You say we have? Absolutely. I know they're not perfect. You know they're not perfect. But God has a plan for them. And God, way back in their inception, said, I will bless them that bless you. I will curse them that curse you. And it's really played out. So Antiochus Epiphanes grew to hate the Jews, and it was so bad, it was so intense, that even lost secular historians speculate that it had to be demonic. He loathed the Jews, he detested the Jews, and then he set out to annihilate the Jews. What would drive such hatred? You ever wondered about that? We've all heard, or most of us have heard of Wycliffe. Remember that? Wycliffe translated the Bible into the language of the people, and the Church of Rome was furious about that. Well, anyway, Wycliffe died 44 years later. Pope Martin V had such intense hatred for him, he had his bones dug up and burned his bones and threw the ashes in the river, like showed him you'd have to be possessed, honestly. Well, that's what Antiochus had for the Jews. Notice in verse number 28, it says, then shall he, that's Antiochus, return unto his land with great riches, and his heart shall be against the holy covenant, and he shall do exploits and return unto his own land. Notice here, oddly enough, on his way down to Egypt to conquer Egypt, when he went through Israel, the Jews hailed him as a great conquering hero. They were on the side of the Assyrians, and so they gave him honor. It was all set up by that compromiser Menelas, and so they give him basically an ovation. But he goes down to Egypt, he conquers them, and on his way back, it's like something snapped. And he comes through Jerusalem and Israel, he looted, he burned, and he massacred. And notice again in verse number 28, then shall he return unto his land with great riches, and his heart shall be against the holy covenant. Now, what's this talking about? Well, it's talking about the temple. It's talking about Judaism. It's talking about the faith of Israel. Antiochus snapped, and on his way back, he stopped at the temple, and he said, I'm going to do something nobody's ever done. He's going to go into the temple. He's going to go into the inner court. He's going to go into the Holy of Holies. And I'm telling you, for the Jewish people, that's like asking for World War III. You know, there's always been a very tight connection between the Jews and their temple. And it's always been extremely blasphemous to the Jews to desecrate the temple. In fact, back in the days of the Apostle Paul, he completes his third missionary journey. He goes back to Jerusalem, and there he's kind of trying to hold up some vow and hang out in the temple. And at the end of that vow, the men of Israel catch him in the temple. And watch what happened in Acts 21. They said, men of Israel, help! This is the man that teacheth all men everywhere against the people and the law and this place. And further brought Greeks also into the temple and hath polluted this holy place. Now that didn't happen, but it was assumed it had happened. They had seen him walking around town with a fellow by the name of Trophimus, an Ephesian, and assumed Paul had brought him into the temple. He hadn't. He knew better than that. But on the heels of this, they go about trying to beat Paul to death. They close the doors, they bring him in, and they start to beat him to death. And from the fortress of Antonia, the Romans always had a bird's eye view of what was going on. From their vantage, they raced down the steps. They went in there. They rescued, of all people to rescue Paul's life, it was the Romans. But all Jerusalem was in an uproar because of something that happened in the temple. Well, Antiochus Epiphanes had no respect for the temple. And I don't know what it was, but he had something in his craw. And so he went into the outer court of the temple. All right, that's fine. Gentiles can do that. That's allowed. But then he goes into the inner court. That was for Jews only. That was a no-no. But he did something unthinkable at that point. He went into the holy place, the Holy of Holies. And only the high priest was allowed in there, and only once a year, and only with blood. But Antiochus Epiphanes had the nerve to go into the Holy of Holies. I'm telling you, this was touchy even for the high priest to do once a year. And in fact, he better be prayed up or he's going to wind up dead. And you've heard the stories on that. Remember when the ark was stolen by the Philistines? And then they had some plagues. We'll just leave it at that. And so they send the ark back, and it winds up in Beth Shemesh. And 50,000 people in Beth Shemesh take a look into the ark, and they ended up dead. That was just really a bad